Shavua Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perek Gimel, Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranvai, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Migan Eden. Amen. Someone who makes an Eruvet Techumin does not need to put the food in exactly the place that he intends to designate as his new residence. As long as the food is accessible from the designated place during Ben Hashmashah, during the twilight period on Friday evening, the Eruv is valid. We know the period of Ben Hashmashah lasts from sunset until the appearance of 3 stars. Now it is a matter of doubt whether this period belongs to the outgoing day or the incoming night, as the Rambam teaches us in Ilchot Shabbat chapter 5 Halakha 4. But the commentator is right in this case, the Eruv is valid. Now for an Eruv to be valid, the owner must be able to access and eat it during Ben Hashmashot, because this is when an Eruv takes effect. Now it's not necessary for him to actually take and eat the food then. It suffices that he can do so in theory. Now this Mishnah discusses some applications of this law. It starts with the case of a tree that is in a public domain. The person wants to establish his residence on the ground next to the tree in the public domain, but he put the food on one of the tree's branches. If he put the food on a tree and it is above 10 tfachim, his eruv is not a valid eruv because the food is in a private domain. He put the food on a branch that has the dimensions of a reshut yachid. It is 4 tfachim long, 4 tfachim wide, and has a vertical height of 10 tfachim. And so it would be forbidden during Ben Hashmashah to bring the food to the place in the public domain that he wants to establish as his residence. Since he cannot take the food at the necessary time, the eruv is invalid. However, if he put the food below 10 tfachim, meaning he put on a branch with a vertical height of less than 10 tfachim, his eruv is a valid eruv. Now the food in this case is not in a private domain, but a karmelit. We know a karmelit is an area that measures at least 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, but is neither a reshut yachid because it's not 10 tfachim high, nor reshut rabim because it's not used by the public, or because it is not 16 amot wide. Now according to biblical law, the melachav transferring applies only to carrying between a private domain and a public domain, and it's therefore permitted to carry from any domain to a karmelit and vice versa. The rabbis, however, prohibited carrying in and out of a karmelit. Now, since carrying from a karmelit to a public domain is prohibited only rabbinically, and rabbinic prohibitions are lifted during Ben Hashmashot for the sake of making an eruvet techumin, he is permitted, therefore, in this case, to take the food at the required time, which makes the eruv valid. And the commentator is right, during Ben Hashmashot on Friday evening, it is halachically unclear whether Shabbat has begun. So one is allowed to transgress a rabbinic prohibition at this time for the sake of a mitzvah, like we will learn, and like we will learn in chapter 8, Mishnah 1, and eruvet techumin may be made only for the purpose of a mitzvah. So it's therefore permitted to transgress a rabbinic prohibition during Ben Hashmashot to establish an eruv. Again, we're just reading the Mishnah. We're not saying practically what a person can do during the Ben Hashmashot period. We are reading according to the Mishnah. The Mishnah now cites the law where someone wants to establish his residence in the karmelit and he put the food in a private domain. If he put the food in a pit, even if it's 100 amot deep, his eruv is a valid eruv. Now the pit is a private domain. A pit is a reshut yachid if it's at least 4 tefachim long, 4 tefachim wide, and 10 tefachim deep. And he wants to establish his residence in the adjacent area, which is a karmelit. Now carrying from a private domain to a karmelit is forbidden only rabbinically. And like we mentioned above, rabbinic prohibitions are lifted during Ben Hashmashot for the sake of making an eruvet techumin. So the eruv is therefore valid, since he is permitted to access the food from his intended residence at the necessary time. So the Mishnah now presents another type of situation in which the food is in a place adjacent to the intended residence. Nitano berosh hakaneh or berosh hakundas. If he placed the food on top of a reed or on top of a pole, and he wants to make his residence next to the reed or pole, bizman shu talush v'nautz afilu gavoa mea amar is eruv. As long as the reed had been uprooted and is only stuck into the ground, then even if it's 100 amot high, this is a valid eruv. Now there's no problem of carrying in this case, because the top of the reed or pole is an exempt area from which carrying is permitted even under rabbinic law, which the commentators explain. Even a karmelit has a minimum size, 4 tefachim long and 4 tefachim wide. a smaller area is not a kamelit but makom patur, an exempt area, and there is no prohibition, even rabbinic, against carrying from a makom patur to any other type of domain or vice versa. The top of a reed or pole which measures less than 4 by 4 tefachim is a makom patur, and one is therefore allowed to take something from it into any domain. Now, nevertheless, the eruv is valid only if the reed had been uprooted, because if it were still planted in the ground, taking the food from it would be prohibited for fear that one will break a piece off the reed, which is forbidden under the melacha of reaping. Now, the Rav explains the rabbis forbade taking an object that is on top of a reed because one might break the reed, which is a biblical transgression. Now, although rabbinic prohibitions are lifted during Ben Hashmashot for the sake of an eruv, this prohibition was left in place because the reed is so fragile that one is almost certain to break it. But if the reed is merely stuck in the ground and not planted, this concern is irrelevant and the eruv is valid. So the Mishnah's last case now involves food that is locked in a wooden cabinet. The lock is attached to the cabinet by a rope. Nitano b'migdal va'avad ha'mafteach harei eruv. If you put the food in a cabinet, lock the cabinet, and then lost the key, this is a valid eruv. Now, although he cannot open the lock, he can open the cabinet during Ben Hashmashot by cutting the rope with a knife. Now, cutting the rope on Shabbat is rabbinically prohibited, and like other rabbinic prohibitions, this one is lifted during Ben Hashmashot for the sake of an eruv. Rabbi Eliezer but Rabbi Eliezer says, if he does not know that the key is in its place, meaning that it might be lost, it is not a valid eruv. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it is prohibited to cut the rope with a knife. Therefore, if the key might be lost, the eruv is invalid, which the commentaries explain. Rabbi Eliezer maintains that using a knife to cut the rope is forbidden under the laws of muktzeh. He takes a stringent view of muktzeh and maintains that even a utensil whose primary use is permitted may be moved only for that primary purpose. So, for example, a knife designated for cutting food may not be moved for cutting anything else. Now, like we spoke about in chapter 17, Mishnah 4, Mishnah Masechet Shabbat. Now, in our Mishnah's case, only a food knife is available, and therefore it is impossible to open the cabinet except by committing two rabbinic transgressions. A, moving the knife for something other than cutting food, and B, cutting the rope. Now, an activity that involves two rabbinic prohibitions is forbidden even during Ben Hashmashot. And the Rav tells us, the halakha does not follow Rabbi Eliezer. And that is then Rabotai of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Dalet now deals with additional cases in which the food for an eruvet techumin is not available during Ben Hashmashot. Nitgalgen chutz tchum. If one placed the food near the edge of his tchum, almost 2,000 amot from his regular residence, and it rolled out of the tchum. Now the commentaries explain, unless a person makes an effective eruv, his tchum is measured from the house in which he sleeps at night. So therefore, if before Ben Hashmashot, when an eruv takes effect, the food rolled beyond the tchum as measured from his house, he will be forbidden to reach it during Ben Hashmashot. V'nafal alav gal o nisraf, or a pile of rubble fell on it, or it was burned. Now, to reach the food, one would have to dig it out with tools if a pile of rubble fell on it. Now, that would be a biblical melacha and not just a rabbinical transgression. And we know a biblical melacha may not be done during Ben Hashmashot, even for the sake of establishing an eruv, like we learned in the previous Mishnah. Or tiruma nitmet, or it was tiruma and it became tameh, may no longer be eaten. We know terumah that became tameh is unfit to be used for an eruv because it may not be eaten by anyone. In each of these cases, the law is as follows: Mi be'od yom eno eruv. If the accident happened when it was certainly still daytime before Ben Hashmashot on Friday, it is not a valid eruv because the food could not be accessed or it could not be eaten during Ben Hashmashot. Mi shechashecha rez eruv. But if the accident happened after it had definitely become dark, after Ben Hashmashot, this is a valid eruv. Now, since the food could be eaten during Ben Hashmashot, the eruv took effect at the time. It then remains in force throughout Shabbat, regardless of what happens to it later. Im safek, if it is unknown when the accident happened, the law is the subject of a machloket, of a dispute. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda omrim, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say, Harezeh chamar gamal, this is like a person driving a donkey and a camel who cannot walk in front of the donkey or behind the camel, but only between the two animals. Now, a donkey is driven from behind, while a camel is led from the front. Therefore, a person who guides both at the same time must walk between them. So in our case, the owner may walk only between the eruv and his house. He may not go beyond the eruv because the eruv might be invalid, and he may not go beyond his house in the opposite direction because the eruv might be valid. Therefore, he is confined to the area between the two. And the commentaries explain, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold that since it's not known whether the eruv took effect or not, the owner must accept both possibilities. he must accept that the Eruv may be valid, which means that his tchum would be measured from the Eruv. But at the same time, he must accept the possibility that the Eruv is not valid, which means that his tchum is measured from his house. Therefore, he may go neither more than 2,000 amot from his house, nor more than 2,000 amot from his Eruv. And the result is that he may not leave the area where the two tchumin overlap. And when a person can see the diagram brought down by the notes article elucidated, he will clearly be able to see how far the person can travel. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon omrim, but Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say Safek Eruv kasher, an Eruv of unknown status is valid. Since the Eruv was known to be accessible and fit to eat when it was placed, we assume that it stayed that way through Ben Hashmashot. Now this is based on the principle of Chazakah, which states that we assume that something remains in its original state and has not changed unless we know with certainty that it did. Amar Rabbi Yossi said, Av Tulmos He'id Mishum Chamisha Zkenim Al Safek Eruv Shekasher. Av Tulmos attested in the name of 5 sages that an Eruv of unknown status is valid. The Chen Halacha, the Rav says this is the Halacha, and that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Shavua Tov. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.